Have you ever had to pitch a donor but not known the words to say? In this video, we're going to walk through step by step how to create a really compelling donor pitch. We're going to dive in depth on what we call the pitch path, how to lay out a compelling case for what you do and why the donor should give to your organization. Hi, I'm Trevor Bragdon, and today's video is on the pitch path. 8 steps to build the ultimate donor pitch. So let's dive in. The biggest challenge we see with nonprofit leaders when they want to sit down with a donor and ask for a really large donation is they haven't thought big enough, and they don't have a big enough vision. So the first step for creating a compelling pitch is to really sit back and think about, where do I want to take my organization over the next 2 to 5 years? And sit down and just think about, what are the big things I want to accomplish? Now, these could be things you already have planned, or they also could be things where they're kind of a dream and you're not quite sure all the steps to get there, but you know if you did this, you would have a big impact with the people that you serve. So the very first step is to sit down and think about, what is your big vision? What would you do? If money was no object, what would you try to accomplish? What would you get done? If you don't know where you're going, how is your donor going to be confident in writing a really large check to your organization? So start with thinking and figuring out what your big vision is and where you're going to go when you partner with this donation and donor in a really big way. The second factor to think about before you ever even write one line of your pitch is this concept called the poverty mindset. And the poverty mindset is where we focus so much on the short term and what's right in front of us that we forget to look up and kind of look in the future at the long term. And we make sacrifices that kind of optimize things for our organization in the short run, but set us up for failure in the long run. And one of my favorite stories about this came from a student who attended one of our first trainings. And he told about how at his organization, when he started there, they were kind of a struggling nonprofit and the financial outlook wasn't very good. And when he got to the office, he noticed a lot of the light bulbs were out. And so he started asking the staff, why are the light bulbs out? And what they had said was they were trying to save money, so they hadn't replaced any of the light bulbs in their headquarters. So imagine that. You're in a struggling nonprofit and it's literally getting dimmer and dimmer each week because no one's replacing the light bulbs. So what that leader did is he went out and bought light bulbs with his own money and replaced all the light bulbs to prove they were going to be sticking around and they weren't going to have this poverty mindset. It's that whole idea that you're more like Oliver Twist, with that, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" And donors are giving to you out of pity. That's just not the case. You want donors who are partnering with you on your big vision and willing to give to your organization in a big way. Effective fundraising never comes from a poverty mindset. Effective fundraising starts with having a really big vision of where you want to go and rejecting the poverty mindset and instead thinking about your donors as partners who want to be with you every step of the way as you accomplish big things and have an impact on the world. Now let's jump into the pitch. Whether you like it or not, all of life is sales. We're always selling somebody or bringing in and persuading them to come over to our idea. It might be your spouse on where to go to dinner, or it might be getting your coworkers to agree with you on a project. But when it comes down to when we decide to do something, whether it's buying a product, giving a donation, it comes down to, at the heart of it, we just decide that we want to do it. And we have an emotional response. And then we go ahead and we backfill it with logic. So we have this emotional response, and then we say, well, the reason I did it, and then we fill in a logical explanation. The same is true with major donations. We feel the emotion that we want to do it, and then we fill in the details of why we want to do it. So the thing with a great pitch is you have to have both logic to explain the reasons on why to give, but also you have to have emotion to kind of get the donor excited and get them bought into what you're doing. So you want to appeal to both logic and then also emotion in your pitch. And you don't want to be just heavy on the stories and heavy on the emotion, because then they won't have that narrative to think about the actual reasons to give. But you also don't want to be over here only talking about logic and like all of the practical reasons to give, because then you don't have the emotional response. So you want to weave the two of those together. So that's the beauty of this pitch path. We go from emotion to logic, back and forth throughout the course of this pitch, so the donor can feel both that tug of the emotion, but also justify and really be able to back it up with hard facts. What we find with leaders is they tend to be strong in one area or the other. One leader might be really good at telling stories and getting that emotional appeal. And then another leader might be more of an execution sort of person, where they're really focused on getting things done, and they tend to be really good on the logic side, explaining step by step what to do. It doesn't really matter which side you come from, because both natural gifts can be a great place to build a pitch. But what you will have to do, if you're more on the logic side, you'll have to work on building in the emotion into your pitch. And if you're more on the emotion side over here, you'll have to work more on the emotion side in describing the steps of what you want to do and how you're going to actually execute the vision. Let's dive into the 8 parts of the pitch path. Now, step number 1 along the path is you start with a thank you. And you want to thank the donor. If they've been a previous donor to your organization, you want to thank them for the total amount that they've given to your organization. And you're doing this for 2 reasons. 1, it's to actually go and do the homework and find out how much they've given to you and how much they have partnered with you along the way, so you can really remember what a core supporter they are to your organization. And the second part is you want to convey to them your gratitude, and then also your numbers. You're on top of what's going on at your organization. The other reason is likely if these donors have given to you for multiple years, this number that you're going to thank them for, their total lifetime donations, is probably higher than what you're going to ask them for a donation. So it helps anchor them at a higher number and reminds them of how much they've contributed to the success of your organization and how much they've partnered with you along the way. So the thank you might look something like this. You might just say, "Hi, Mr. Jones. Just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me. And I was looking at our records, and over the last 5 years, you've given $126,000 to our organization. And I just want to say thank you, because without your partnership and your support, we wouldn't be where we are today. So thank you." And after you say thank you, you want to pause, because you want to express that gratitude and make sure they're feeling that immense gratitude that you have for how much they have supported your organization. Now, if this is a prospect, someone who's never given to your organization, you want to thank them for their time. Or if they're well known for being philanthropic in your sector of the nonprofit world, you can thank them for their generosity and how much they've given. So you could say something like, "Thanks for sitting down with me, Mr. Jones. I just want to start by saying thank you for how generous you've been with kids' education. I've seen how much you've given along the years and followed your career, and you really have given a lot and changed a lot of lives. So I just want to start by thanking you for your impact." Now, the next part of the pitch, after you've thanked them, you want to go to the mission. This is the part of the pitch where you talk about the mission of your organization, what you guys do and why you do it. Now, it might seem counterintuitive to talk about the mission of your organization to an existing donor. But here's the thing. Most donors give to multiple charities in any given sector. So reminding them of exactly what you do and how you do it is an important thing to do. Also, when you give them a really tight and compelling way of talking about the work you do, it gives them the currency or the words to go and tell other people about your work and your mission. And this could be a great place to talk a little bit about the origin story of your nonprofit. A couple sentences reminding them of where you guys have come from and why you were started. There's this interesting story with the producer of Gilligan's Island. And he was asked, "Why do you always have this long theme song that talks about why the people are shipwrecked on the island?" And he said this. He says, "I have that on every show because confused people don't laugh." The same is true with donors. Confused donors don't give. So remind them of the mission of your organization and why you were started. The second part is your origin story. And that story had a lot of power when you sit down and think about it. That was the story that was told to the first donors of your organization. There was something exciting about that story, something that resonated with them that gave those donors the confidence to give to just the germ of an idea, that little spark in the imagination, and to help it grow into what you are today. So be sure to keep telling that origin story over and over again. So not only your new donors find out about it and learn about it, but also your staff and the other people, because that power of that origin story likely carries on today. The next stage of the pitch path is the need. We've thanked the donor, we've talked about the mission and the origin story, and now we're going to talk about the need. This is where you tell the story of somebody who needs the work you do. This can be where you tell the story of an individual, somebody who you've recently helped, or somebody who's in need of the services you provide. Ideally, the more recent, the better. This is where you just find that story that really highlights the need of the work you do, and you tell it in a really compelling way. One way you can do this and tell this story so it connects in an emotional way with them is to think about your interaction with this person, if you worked with them, and to go about and really think about a moment in time with that individual, and then talk about what it felt like or what they were doing. So what it is you're taking kind of a big picture view of this situation, telling the donor a little bit, and then zooming in on a very specific moment of interaction or a moment of need or a moment this individual conveyed something to you, and then zoom back out and talk about how you help multiple people just like this. So in this part, the need, you're really just highlighting why you do the work you do with a really compelling story that's kind of that ideal story of the need of the work of your nonprofit. In some ways, you can think of this stage as giving a human face to the mission of your nonprofit. Now, after you've talked about the mission, the need, then you want to say, and that's why we're working on, and you move into the stage of the pitch, which is called the plans for today. So with the plans for today, this is where you can talk about the actual work you're doing today. So those of you who really like the logic side of things, this is where you can really shine. This is where you look down at what you're working on today and describe it and talk about it in a compelling way. Now, you don't want to talk about everything you're doing, right? The 40 different projects you have going on in the field or all of the different programs you have running. But what you want to do is think about maybe 2 or 3 big projects you're working on right now. And you can kind of think of them as almost buckets that you can put your work into so you can describe it quickly to a donor. And that's why it's so important that we're doing 2 big things right now. We're working on, and you talk about it, and then give a little bit of detail, and then you say, and you talk about the second thing and give an additional level of detail. This is where you could add in a little interesting detail, a fact, or a story that the donor would want to share with somebody else. When Malcolm Gladwell is writing his books, he calls these little phrases or these little stories that you kind of want to share and you're like kind of excited to share with somebody. These interesting tidbits he calls candy. Think about some interesting fact about the work you do or some kind of counterintuitive fact or statistic that really makes the point. Or even just something interesting that just surprises people and makes them want to share that story with somebody else. After you're done talking about the plans for today, then you want to talk about your impact. What's happened because of the work you're doing right now? And this is a great place to tell a success story. And a good way to think about this is to think about what is your favorite story from the last 3 to 6 months of your organization. Just think about that one that really resonates with you, that kind of gets you excited and keeps you inspired to do the work you do. You want to tell that story. And here's the thing, a lot of times you think you want to tell your best story, and you could make a case for that. But what I prefer is when a leader picks the story that really resonates right here with them. because that emotion comes through when you're giving the pitch. When you're telling a story that's your favorite story, and the story that so compelling to you, you can't help but have that enthusiasm, that excitement, that emotion gets transmitted from you to the donor. So pick your favorite story from the last 3 to 6 months and build it into the pitch here. How you're framing up this story here is from the point of impact. How those plans for today you just discussed, how they're having an impact on an individual and having a good result. And again, that story formula works well where you kind of look at the big picture and then zoom in on a specific and add a level of detail. One of the good ways to think about when you're telling this impact story is to think about telling it from the perspective of the donor being right beside you. So if you're telling about how you were talking to somebody on their porch, tell it from the perspective like the donor is sitting there right beside you. Kind of describe the scenario and describe the scene and add in some vivid details like this person that you were talking about was sitting in a red chair, rocking back and forth. Just these little few details added in, add vibrancy to the story, but also help it be a vivid memory in your donor's mind. Because if they can picture it, if they can create a picture in their mind's eye of the story as you're telling it, and you have that great emotion because it's your favorite story, if you can combine those two things, it makes it really easy for the donor to remember and then share with somebody else. And it really doesn't matter if they get all the details right, it's the fact that they remember some of the details in the whole arc of the story and the emotions associated with it when they're sharing it with someone else. Now, after you're done talking about the impact that you've had, you want to look forward. And at this point in the pitch, we're at kind of a critical juncture. Up to this point, we've talked about the past. We've talked about why we started, the success, the impact, what you're working on today. But now we're looking towards the future. And you're kind of asking the donor in some ways to go on a journey with you, because we both know the future is uncertain. So what you want to do is paint a picture of what the future is going to look like and what your best guess of where you're going to go. Now, this isn't to say you're going to know every detail along the way. That's impossible, and if the last few years have taught us anything, it's impossible to really predict the future. But what you want to do here is you want to lay out your plans for the future and lay out kind of big picture where you're going to go. So as you lay out what you want to accomplish over the next 1 to 2 years, your goal here is to do 2 things. 1, you want to inspire confidence with your donor that you have a plan going into the future and you know where you're going to go. The second part is you're going to give the donor 1 or 2 memorable things you're planning to do to again reinforce both that emotion and the logic. They've heard compelling stories, but then they need to know what are the specifics, what are the plans for the future that back that up. So you say something like, over the next 2 years, we have some big plans. We're going to roll out 3 big initiatives, and then you list them off and you talk about each one. The key here is when you're speaking with somebody in a verbal pitch, right? They're not reading something where they can go back and kind of reread it if they get confused. So when you're speaking through something and you're going to go through like 3 points or 3 parts of a plan, it's really good to signal and frame up at the beginning of that section that you're going to talk about 3 things. What you're doing is kind of giving them a road sign. Say, oh, okay, I'm going to talk about something a little abstract here. It's going to be 3 of them, but if you repeat them a couple times, it makes it more memorable. So you might say, we have 3 big things we want to accomplish over the next 3 years. First, we want to do X, then we want to do Y, and then Z. And then when you go through and you're done explaining those 3 things, you can say again, and that's why those big 3, X, Y, and Z, are so important to get done over the next 2 years. So after you've laid out your plans for the next couple of years, you want to move into section number 7, the hope. And this is where you want to paint a vision of the future. And you want to tell a story of what the world is going to look like because you and the donor partner together. That 1, that 2, that 3 steps that you laid out. If you accomplish that, and if the donor partners with you, how is the world going to be different? What's the impact you're going to have? And then tell the story of an individual and how their life is better off. And then you end that story kind of looking at a hopeful future. So with those first stories you talked about earlier in the pitch, where you talked about the impact and the success. Those are good stories, but this one you want to leave sort of open-ended, where you want to talk about how a life will be changed, but their future will be brighter because you and the donor partnered together. And this could also be a group of people. It doesn't just have to be an individual, but really think about why and how a life or a group of people will be different if you and the donor partner together and make this change. And after the hope, you want to go into the ask. Now, if the donor is given to you before, you want to ask for a specific amount. You know their giving history, and you should ask for a specific amount, likely more than they gave last year. Now, if it's a prospect, you can ask for a range. And we have a great video on what's called the elevator close. And that's all about how you ask for a specific range with new donors. But when you make the ask, you want to set up and say, and that's why it's so important that we have partners like you. And that's why I'm asking for you to consider a gift of, and then you say the amount, and then you stop talking. And you want to be silent. And this is really hard to do. And seasoned fundraisers know how important this silence is. But the key here is you've just given your donor a lot to process. They've gone through and listened to your mission, the plans for today, the stories of the impact and the success you've had, and then you've painted this really beautiful vision of the future and what would happen if they partner with you. And if you think about all that information you've given them, it takes a little time to process it. So give them the time. You're asking them for a lot of money. Be respectful and just be silent and let them speak first. So the silence here can last for what feels like, 30 seconds sometimes. It's usually less than that. It's, 10, 15 seconds. But let them speak first. And a lot of times they're going to decide and say, let me think about it. And that's perfectly fine. Most donors don't decide on the spot. Maybe you have donors that do, but most of the time they don't. But the thing is about having this great pitch, we've talked about all these different parts, is when that donor goes back and talks to their spouse or, other decision makers in their family, they will have great stories to share. They'll have some memorable elements of what you've told them. And each time they talk about it, they can talk about the emotion that they felt, those emotional stories, but also back it up with the specifics, those plans for execution that you talked about, what you were working on today, and then your plans for the future. So the beauty of having a compelling pitch is you're giving donors the currency to go back and share the work you're doing with other people while they're in the decision-making process, and tell that story and tell those moments of impact again and again to other folks. So now you understand the 8 parts of a really compelling pitch, this pitch path. How do you go about writing a pitch? Well, what we'd recommend is you download our pitch template. And this is just a simple Google document that goes through and has the prompts of each of these 8 sections. And then what you can do is just go ahead and write out some bullet points really quick on each section. I'd recommend 3 or 4 for each section. And you're not looking for perfection. Just get some ideas down on paper and go through and think about those favorite stories and what you're working on today and how to categorize that. Now, the best thing to do once you have the bullet points down is think about a specific donor, someone you need to talk to in the next few weeks, and make an ask. Write that donor's name down. Really think about that donor. And then open up a brand new Word doc or Google Doc and start the dictation function. All computers have it nowadays, and you can start the dictation function or simply record it on your iPhone. But then just talk through those bullet points you've written out in a natural way, like you're just having a pleasant conversation with this donor. And what you'll do by going through these bullet points and just talking about them in this conversational tone is you'll create a first draft of a pitch that's really conversational. And you don't need to worry about this pitch being perfect and being in proper English and being something you would submit to your grammar teacher, right? This is a spoken document. This is something you're going to share one-on-one with somebody and speak it. So it's okay if there's sentence fragments. It's okay if you don't complete thoughts. As long as it flows through and makes sense, then you have a great first draft. And then as you go through it and practice it and try it out with different things, you'll improve it, you'll polish it, you'll get it better. And what we recommend is you practice a lot with your pitch. Because you think about it, these donors are giving away tens, hundreds, maybe even millions of dollars to your organization. It took them years to make that money. Hours and hours and hours of hard work, months and years of planning, tons of risk. To honor the donor and really respect what you're asking them to do, you need to practice your ask. You need to give the best presentation possible, the best way with the most compelling stories. So you can only do this through practice. When you build a great pitch, then you want to practice it and make it better. So I'd recommend practicing about 2 hours for every minute of your pitch. Now, that sounds like a lot, 2 hours for every minute of your pitch. So for like an 8-minute pitch, that means 16 hours of practice. But if you do that, you will have tremendous results because the pitch will come so naturally when you're talking about it. It'll feel like a conversation that's really well done. So try out this pitch path. Thank the donor for their previous donation. Tell that mission of what your nonprofit does and that origin story. Then tell that story of need, of why it's so important that you do the work you do. And then talk about the work you're doing right now, that exciting plans for today. And then tell about the success and impact that you've had. Paint that picture of the future and tell about the plans. And then finally, talk about how the world's going to be different. That story of hope if you and the donor partner together. And then end with your ask. And ask for a specific amount or arrange for a new donor. So try this pitch path at your next donor meeting.